What's up, comrades? Welcome to this week's episode of Red Library, a political education podcast for today's left. We're coming at you this week with part 2 of our Todd McGowan reading series on Capitalism and Desire, the Psychic Cost of Free Markets. We're going to be hitting mainly chapter 2 in this episode, and then on the following episode, Comrade Commissar of Degeneracy Alex will be leading us through chapters 3 and 4. In chapter 2, you can expect a lot of zaniness, a lot of good quips, some discussion of Macho Man Randy Savage and WrestleMania. We're going to talk about the distinction between public and private and its relationship to desire in the Lacanian psychoanalytic framework, the colonization of public space and the commons by capital. We're going to talk about Alain Badiou's event. We're going to have some real sad boy hours. We're going to talk about Karens and a whole lot of other good stuff. This one is all over the place, and it is a doozy. Before we jump in, just a quick reminder on a number of Red Library logistical issues, housekeeping, if you will. We are so close to getting up to our goal of 50 patrons, and I want to give a big shout out to all of our new patrons that signed up over the last week or so. We see y'all. You are valid. You are lovely boo-boos. We thank you for your support, your spiritual, material, emotional, cognitive support, all of it. If you'd like to help us get to that goal of 50 patrons, remember to look in the show notes, and you can head over to Patreon, and for as little as $1 per month, that roughly breaks down to $0.25 an episode. You can get access to all of our exclusive content. We just dropped a patron-only episode on Nicolas Cage and the aesthetics of cosmic horror. We usually do one patron episode at the end of each month. You can get access to our Discord server where you can hang out and talk and post memes. We just had a great discussion about a new form of Marxist thought oriented around all of us having Gundams. So, we talk about shit like that. It's good. It's fun. And we also are hosting Red Library Cinema, which is a movie night every Tuesday where we watch sometimes some really good films, a lot of times some really bad films, and have a lot of fun tearing them apart, making jokes, providing icy cold motherfucking takes, and the usual stuff that we do on our episodes. Remember to like the show on Facebook, to follow us on Twitter. If you are listening on iTunes, please go down and click on one of those star ratings, ideally one of the higher star ratings, but if you want to give us one, I don't agree, but I respect it. And mainly just subscribe to the show and share it around, as we are just mostly focusing on building our listener base right now and always. Please remember that Red Library is now part of the Lost Horizons podcasting network, along with our excellent comrades at the From78 Podcast and the Regrettable Century. We now have an exclusive Lost Horizons podcasting network feed where we host roundtable discussions from various participants from all the different shows together talking about a wide range of topics. If you like what we do here on Red Library, we think you're going to love that. So look down in the show notes and find a link if you want to go check it out. All right, y'all, that's it. Nothing fancy this week. Just getting right down to business. So here we go. Me, Comrade Adam, Comrade Commissar Don, Comrade Commissar Alex, and newly ordained Comrade Commissar / Podrad in the Lost Horizons network, Neil, talking about Todd McGowan's Capitalism and Desire, the Psychic Cost of Free Markets, Chapter 2. We'll see you back here afterward. All right, the podcast factory has been turned on. We're here to make some podcasts. Yes. All right, so we're here for McGowan Round 2. We have a all-star cast, except for me.
Or me.
or
hey now.
Or Don.
You're
or
Alex.
It's really just Neil. It's the only all-star here.
Oh, man. Wow. You know what that just reminds me of? This is already, we're off to a great digression here. Did any of you guys ever follow the NBA All-Star game when that was going, years ago when, I don't know if they still do it this way, but fans used to, vote for who would be in the All-Star game?
Yeah, I remember that.
Does this sound familiar at all? So there was this one year where Steve Nash made a YouTube video, campaigning to be in the All-Star game. And it was basically him saying, vote for me. And then it was a cut to game footage, right? And it's him taking a shot and getting denied. He's like, Steve Nash. And it's somebody stealing the ball from him. He's like, because I'm, and it's somebody sets a pick and he just falls down. And then he goes, awesome. And then it's just him shooting an air ball, nothing. And I voted for him a lot.
I remember that video. I totally remember that. I'm going to paste that in because that video was really amazing.
Everybody don't forget to vote for me for All-Star Game because I'm awesome.
That was what turned me into a postmodernist.
That was?
Yeah, I think
Steve
so.
Nash turned you into a postmodernist.
Yeah, I think so. I think Nash really, that video, the sort of self-deprecating, self-critical nature of it, I think it really just got me on the Frederick Jameson, / Deleuze and Guattari theory train.
You bought a Jameson book that night.
I did. And then I went and had Steve Nash sign it.
Opened up your Scholastic catalog. ordered a
You know, this isn't true, but from now on, I'm going to say the thing that turned me into a postmodernist is when Russell Westbrook was giving an interview, and a reporter pointed out that his big glasses, his big hipster glasses that were red, had no lenses in them. And he said, I see better without them.
Well, now that we're talking about this, I think we also need to finish going around the circle here. So, CC Don, CC Alex, what moment turned you into a postmodernist before we start McGowan?
Oh, shit.
I don't claim postmodernism. I'm trying to think of something, though. Maybe go back around and I'll have something later.
All right.
Yeah, I'm going to need longer to think about this,
All
to
right.
be honest with you.
By the end of the episode, you are now obligated.
It might have been
the
the madness and the mayhem. I don't know.
Oh, the Macho Man video?
Yeah.
Yeah, sure.
When the madness met the mania. I am talking about Macho Madness and Hulkamania, two mega powers meeting here tonight. Hulk Hogan, what is happening?
Well, you know me, Gene, we really don't know what we're dealing with here, man. And I'm just kind of a little worried about locking up here.
It's all right.
Because we just might blow the whole planet up, you know. Everybody knows that Hulkamania is the strongest force in this universe. But when I hit that ring and I saw what the madness was all about, I realized there was a whole nother universe out there, a whole nother frontier, and the power of the madness and the mania just blew my 24-inch guns out, man.
There was definitely a
The Ultimate Maniacs.
there
On
was
the
some
tag
good
team
ones.
with the Ultimate Warrior.
Oh, have
yeah.
you seen that? Yeah, where Savage and the Ultimate Warrior were tag teamed, and they were going against like the Nasty Boys or something. Yes, yeah, that definitely was that was interesting. They didn't want to work together, both prima donnas, but
Yeah.
they ended up working together in the end and completely annihilating the Nasty Boys because like who cared about them, right?
Yeah, subpar. Nasty
They
Boys
were
were
like
subpar tag team.
patsy villains.
Yeah. Also, Neil, I don't know if you know this, but we have now been claiming the Macho Man Randy Savage, big ups, R.I.P. Macho Man, as the patron saint of Red Library.
Oh, yeah!
Yes.
Oh, wow.
Yeah,
I didn't know
is.
that, no.
You know,
Uh-huh.
at least that,
Get
if
your
not
money.
like our spirit animal.
I actually remember, I can't remember if it was WrestleMania 2 or 3 when Savage won the title. You know, it was like his turn. Hogan had been the heavyweight champion for so long, and then Savage won, and it was a big deal. Him and Miss
Honestly, don't
Elizabeth.
remember,
I remember that. Remember that well.
Yeah.
Isn't that trip down memory lane we're taking here? Did not expect to talk Macho Man and wrestling to start the McGowan, but fuck, I love it. I love that we're here.
I was gonna say I got notes in front of me, man. Like I can I can talk about some McGowan too. I read, I prepared, I wrote words down, I spell checked them.
It's more
I'm
than
ready.
I did. So
Throw them in the trash. It's now a WrestleMania episode. We're going to do Roland Barth's essay on wrestling.
Ooh.
Yeah, which I actually really want to
Oh,
do at some
dude,
point.
actually, have you read the blog The Spectacle of Excess?
No, I don't think so.
You got to Google that, dude. So it's people writing about modern day wrestling, but writing in the style of Roland Barthes.
Oh, my God.
What?
We're on it.
Everything on there is like that, and it is incredible. It's amazing.
I'm not even waiting. I'm
I heard
pulling
about
it up
it.
right now.
I heard about it. I'm going to actually plug another podcast here. There's another podcast called Owls at Dawn, and they had one of the writers who writes for that blog on as a guest. And I was listening to it, and it was one of those things where they started talking about it, and I thought, like, I'm going to turn this off in about 2 minutes. And I was captivated. And then I went and I read the blog, and I now subscribe to it. It's in my RSS reader. I read that thing and enjoy the shit out of it. I love it.
So the very first post I see is called "Not Holding Back" on Sami Zayn's silence and speaking. I'm gonna blow so many hours this week reading this fucking blog.
It's incredible, man.
Damn,
You will
that
not regret that decision.
That was a really productive, weird side road to go down because we now are talking about this blog, and you've been greatly improved my quality of life. So
I'm here to help.
that's why you're now a comrade commissar, as we've dubbed you last episode.
That's why I get paid the medium-sized dollars.
That's why I get paid the barely living wage dollars for doing podcasts. Let's do this shit.
All right.
CC Neil, Podred Neil, I think you're up to lead us through chapter 2, the psychic construction of private space.
So there's a bunch of really big ideas, I think, in this chapter. And what I've tried to do, and my plan here is that I'm going to kind of talk about the ideas that stood out to me the most, try to say a couple of things about them, maybe read a couple of lines from the text and see what you all happen to think about those ideas, those lines of text, so on and so forth. So the first one that kind of came up here is the main idea of how capitalism, and in particular how privatization, which takes place within capitalism, threatens the commons, threatens public ownership of spaces, of places, and of services. Now it's weird, I say spaces and places, and sometimes when I was just talking with somebody about doing this, and they're like, isn't that the same thing? And I said, no, they're not. So like, I think that there are places like parks that you can like take your body to and hang out in, and there are spaces like the internet is a space, I think. And so I think that those are different things. And I would say that what McGowan is pointing out here is the way that spaces, places, and services that might have been public or might even be conceived of as things that are kind of like for the public good become privatized under capitalism. And that there's it's not just those things, it's everything that this is happening with.
In capitalism, the subject seeks to cultivate a private life, not a public one. They become entrepreneurs of the self, and they see the self as this very private thing, not necessarily a public thing that takes place in a space or a place or in an area that you share with other people. And that this has some pretty disastrous impacts on subjectivity and on our psyches. There's a line from the text here that I think captures this fairly well. This happens to be on page number 52. The privatization of the commons also represents a retreat from subjectivity itself and from the way the subject satisfies itself. The subject is inherently a public being. Its subjectivity forms through its interactions or through its interaction with the desire of the big O other. Without this interaction, there would be no subject at all. But capitalism obscures the role of the big O other that it has in forming the subject and works to convince the subject that it exists first and foremost as a private being and that the public interactions occur only on the basis of this privacy. So I figured I'd kick that out to you all. What are your thoughts on that particular line of text or that idea?
So I have to tell you, my first thought whenever we were looking at this chapter is I'm really interested to hear what CC Don thinks about this, because I think we have had some really interesting discussions leading up today about the experience of privacy and how much that's mediated by capital and the sort of colonization of the commons, and how much, we're already assuming that we need the other to construct the idea of privacy in the first place. So I'm putting him on the spot here because he has said to me multiple times he's been excited to talk about this.
Well, I mean, I don't know if it was going to be in this part necessarily. I thought it was going to be maybe more as we get towards the end of the chapter when we're talking about, I think he has like a really interesting section on basically this drive for privacy against like mass surveillance and stuff like that. And I think he's critical of the contemporary sort of approach that just says, we just like that it's specifically our privacy that's being threatened and not necessarily like the public that is or something like that, or the public self that is being threatened. I would say I'd maybe want to save some of that discussion for when we get there. Okay. And I'm sure I'll say some other stuff before then. But I don't want to necessarily jump the gun on that discussion.
No, that's fair.
Yeah, I mean, I like the idea of subjects basically being motivated to create private spaces. I think that's very much something that I have encountered in my experiences in the social world that I live in. It is very interesting how much people value those narratives that sort of surround that space, because I kind of feel like in a lot of ways they're not private spaces that you even have to have any verification for outside of just like your own perspective on what it should be or what it is to you. And it's a very interesting phenomenon, especially when there's like glaring inconsistencies between like the story that someone has of their own private space and the one that everybody else sees of them.
The thing that I really love about this is that it's a very counterintuitive point for most people who maybe have not encountered a sort of Lacanian psychoanalytic approach to subjectivity. The idea that your subjectivity is inherently social in nature precisely because of the way that desire functions and the way that desire is structured. In this sort of perspective, to me, I think is really, really interesting. And I know that we talked a lot about in part one, the sort of idea of conscious and unconscious enjoyment and trying to hash through that. This to me almost feels like a much more simple, like Lacanian idea to grapple with. The idea that from the get-go, your idea of what is desirable or like how that even forms in the first place is never something that is just purely internally generated from you. Like it has to be structured by the other, whether that's the parent or the caregiver or the social field that they're a part of being translated through them in the nuclear family or whatever it is, whatever caregiving relationship you have. So to me, this is also where I really love the connection between a sort of Marxist perspective and a Lacanian psychoanalytic one, because the whole basis that you're starting from is that you are not an individual atomized subject. That is, in a sense, an ideological obscuring of capitalist social relations that even creates that sort of perspective in the first place. So to me, I love it, because this to me also feels just a really hardcore communist point, even though McGowan wouldn't, and Lacan as well, wouldn't necessarily see it that way. I think it actually structures a sort of collective kind of idea of subjectivity from the get-go in a really helpful way.
Before we go on too far talking about this, how he's using public here, I think is maybe a little bit more broad than how maybe I would have understood public. When we're talking about something like Habermas, I feel like his use of the public or public spaces is found in a very specific time period with very specific social structures around it. Or even if I think of, which it's been a while since I've read her, but Hannah Arendt or something like that, there's, some discussion of where the public is an engagement with politics. If McGowan is saying, and maybe Lacan would also agree, that, we start off our life first by being public, I feel like that is a little bit different than maybe what, like I said, someone like Habermas or Arendt would talk about it, because I think for them, there would need to be some specific either social or political structures existing, and those don't exist necessarily in all cultures. Yeah, just give me an idea of when you guys hear public being talked about in this way, where exactly are what are the boundaries of this public? Are
you at all familiar with something called Schema L, which is a Lacanian diagram of subjectivity?
No.
Okay, so I won't get too deep into this. One of the things that schema makes clear is that whenever a person is born, they don't have an identity. There isn't one, not one that they have constructed themselves anyways. What they do have is an identity that has been constructed for them by their parents, by society. They're given a name, they're given a social security number if they're born in the United States. They're given a whole bunch of other identifying characteristics. And then people say they're a boy, they're a girl, whatever. And then people start to treat them that way. So what happens, I think, later is that, eventually we become aware of this and we start to decide to take a more active stance in the cultivation of our identity. We say, I reject this identity that was given to me by my society or by my parents or whatever, and instead I want to be this kind of an identity. And people tend to really, in capitalist societies anyways, privilege that. They privilege their capacity to create a identity, and they think that that's something they do privately, that they do on their own, under their own steam, etc. They don't think they're influenced, I guess, a lot of times when they do that. But what they're kind of disavowing in seeing themselves that way and seeing themselves as the producer of themselves is the role that the public has had on their production. And I think that's kind of what McGowan is getting at here, is that there would be no private self were there not a public. You need the public to precede you and to be born into a public and to start existing in a public before you can even start to create a version of yourself that is private. You can't start from private and move to public. You have to start from public and move to private, is what I think he's getting at. And I'm going to reach for my ray gun here and fire some laser blasts to get ready for that. I teach in university, and so I see people, and I'm 42, so I've seen multiple age cohorts for a while here, and the current age cohort of 20-something kids, who are digital natives, who grew up very much not interacting with each other in public spaces, which is something I kind of want to get to a little bit later in this. I feel as though their subjectivity is weaker than individuals in their own age cohort and in age cohorts prior to them that did a lot more interaction within the public. Because when you start interacting with people in a public space, and this is maybe part of what Arendt even gets to as well, I think, you can't just do what you want, you can't just say what you want, you can't just say it in the time you want to say it. You have to negotiate in public with other people, and it creates a more collectivist and perhaps even cooperative way of being in the world by necessity, ultimately. And that's what I think is going on here. But anyways, my reading of this would be that McGowan is being critical of people who tend to say, like, the public exists, only to service the individual, because he says that there would be no individual were there not a public.
I think one thing I'd want to throw out too, especially thinking about Arendt's The Human Condition and Habermas's The Transformation of the Public Sphere. Again, it's been a little bit since I've read those as well. But my understanding is that their discussion or their sort of analysis of the way that capital or how the public is formed is really thinking about things around like linguistic communication, civil institutions, political structures. And whenever I think about Habermas, the idea that, media essentially being a really vital thing in the public sphere, right, to have an informed citizenry, especially a democratic one. I guess I don't ever remember Habermas approaching it through the lens of desire and how the sort of the psychological functioning of individuals is also sort of being affected. I mean, I think he does see it as capitalism is definitely colonizing sort of the life world in a later Habermasian way to talk about it. But I always felt like the emphasis is very much on these rational, communicative, or civil institution types of approaches. And I think for them, that's how they frame what the public is. So, and just I think the difference for McGowan that I read is that it's starting fundamentally from this level of, the symbolic and language. And I just feel like it's kind of a very different approach than what they would have taken.
Yeah, maybe there's some fully some fully constituted logic of the space of language or the space of politics, and that's how you kind of relate yourself as a subject to the greater public. But I think in McGowan, it's kind of more like the language doesn't necessarily have that constituted nature, but that it's still something that you're thrown into, and you have to pick and choose how you relate to it, and you eventually come to understand that subjectivity as being private to you.
I guess part of my question is that when I read this, I felt like depending on what was being talked about, there seemed to be the word public being used in two very different ways. One, especially when it gets to, I think he moves on to language pretty quickly after that, in which I kind of see public as just a mass of other people that we need to interact with, that control over. And then in other times it seemed like we're talking about, a much more specific idea of what the public is, a space that is not owned by someone or something like that, in a capitalist way. And I'm just kind of trying to find the, either I misunderstood, we can't understand these two things as being the same, or yeah, I don't know. Maybe I just didn't understand it well enough.
I think that maybe what you're getting at, Don, is there's this idea that there are just certain things that we share with each other, language being one of them, right? We share that with other people. I mean, I don't think we could make a claim that language is something that somebody or something owns, even despite the fact that people try to trademark words or phrases and stuff like that. Language itself can't be owned. That's a shared thing. And then there's this other idea of public in the polis sense of the word, right? So it's something which is, in a sense, it is owned, but it's not owned by an individual. It's owned by a collective, right? It's owned by it's something which is there for the good of the citizenry, ultimately. And yeah, I guess I could see that those two things are thrown around in this. But what I think McGowan's point might be is that capitalism tends to privilege private ownership over public ownership, and tends to also privilege kind of having as opposed to, say, sharing, right? And the logic might be that, society, the public, shared spaces exist for the individual. And I think that the inversion here is that actually there is no individual, there can be no individual if there isn't this kind of broader shared public stuff in the form of cultures, norms, etc. Culture is not something that people own. It's out there, and it's the big other, maybe is another way you could describe it, and it constitutes you. And then you can of course influence it. You can interact with it, and through interacting with it, potentially change it in some small way. But it always precedes you, right? You exist due to it. It only is changed potentially because of you, but doesn't exist because of you. I don't know if that's making sense or not, but that's how I see it.
So Don had just said something about your understanding of public and how he was using the word public in two different ways.
Oh yeah, yeah.
I wonder if maybe possibly there's a degree that you're understanding public as being, I think McGowan talks about how it kind of acts as both the thing that defines for you or shapes for you your desire, but also the obstacle that keeps you from being able to fulfill that desire, because it's like thing that you encounter when you try to find that, you know, thing that's going to satisfy you, and it kind of stands in your way because you can't just like, control other people's minds and shit.
Yeah.
But I guess maybe I wonder if maybe what you're understanding as this space that's unclaimed by someone, or this openness that isn't necessarily belonging to any private institution, could maybe be your interpretation of when McGowan is making reference to the thing that you would have accomplished if you could have your desire, or like that space that lies beyond the obstacle of the other and like the public itself. That like there could be an openness there that it didn't belong to anyone, that you would have the freedom to like just actually be yourself in, but you can't accomplish because there's like that obstacle of the other in the way. I don't know, maybe I'm just trying to stretch my brain around like where, because I mean I totally understand that idea of public that you're bringing up, of like the space of commons, like, you know, something that
right.
Like we were talking about like Arendt and stuff, like there's a degree to which I would understand that there, but I guess in this particular reading, I just trying to explanation.
Sorry, really quick. I just want to also emphasize that if we're going to talk about a sort of like dichotomy or distinction between public and private, I think it's just important to recognize that typically the idea of the commons is not the same thing as the public, right? Mm-hmm. That it's sort of like a third space that isn't necessarily mediated by the state or like by civil institutions necessarily. And I just think that's important because we've talked about that enough on like past episodes that I think we should like kind of reference that too.
Right.
And we can like maybe dig into like how the commons relates to this versus public in the sense of maybe more like civil institutions or sort of political structures versus, like something that would be considered common. So I don't know if that muddies the water, but it's something that I was kind of thinking about.
Right.
So Don, let's put it back to you. So what do you think now about your initial question, considering kind of hearing some different thoughts about it?
Yeah, I guess, I still have a question of like when he talks about capitalism as eliminating the public or shrinking the public for the sake of the private, but when then also talks about like public as, you know, something that is essentially like gives us, you know, some definition for our life or something, or is necessary for us to, you know, have something that pushes back against us. Isn't it possible that like cause if I think of a private space, right? I mean, like later he talks about or even uses the examples of something like the difference between a mall, which is a private space, and the difference between, you know, something that, you know, like an actual park or something like that is a public space. Wouldn't the existence of others still function in the same way in private spaces as it would in public spaces? Okay, Neil, you're shaking your head. Yeah. So explain that to me.
No, so here's the difference, I think, as I understand it. So I'm going to kind of go through three versions of this.
Okay.
Imagine like a downtown street, okay, where there's like rows of, you know, restaurants and shops and stuff. Imagine them all, and then imagine like the internet. So in the public high street where there are restaurants and stuff like that is public, which means that people have a right to be there, right? And even the owners have to deal with that. Like they have to deal with the fact that if somebody wants to, you know, for example, like walk around with a sign saying like the end is near or whatever, and they're not using amplification or breaking any rules or whatever, they're just really weird and kind of freaking people out. They got to deal with that because they're in public, right? They don't have the right or the capacity to say to them, get out of here. In theory. Now I understand that in reality, you know, people can use police to do that, but that would be the difference there. In a mall, when it is private space and not public space, yes, there are people in both. There are people on the high street and there are people in the mall. And that means that you kind of have to negotiate and navigate because there are people around you in both places. But in the mall, the owners have the ability to remove people from the space for any reason that they want to, any reason at all. They can say, like, we don't want you here, you know, get out. And you have to do it or else you're trespassing. Where in a true public space, that can't happen, right? People can't trespass in a public space. If they're a member of the public, they have a right to be there. And then on the internet, what happens is that's where the privacy of shopping in your own home or whatever, or ordering food through DoorDash and having it brought to your home or whatever, has actually even now removed the other bodies being around you and having to negotiate those other bodies in a space together, right? So it's gotten even worse in that way. But the key difference there, as I see it, is that in public spaces and shared spaces, you have to share them, even if you don't want to. The owners have to share them with the public, even if the owners don't necessarily want to. In private spaces, that's not the case. The owners can say, you have no right to be here. You have to leave.
So, like, I definitely recognize that difference already, and this is, I mean, one of the reasons why I'm like very partial to this line of reasoning, because I do find great value in public spaces. I guess, like, for my question is like, when we're talking, because this is a book kind of about psychoanalysis, is part of the argument that, I mean, obviously there's a very different experience for the person who is allowed to be there or who is kicked out of the private space, the person that is creating like a disturbance or something like that. Is there also a difference in like psychological experience for the person who, is not causing any concern to the private owners or something like that? Like if I'm just in a mall walking or on a street walking, I mean, to me, it doesn't seem like psychologically there's that much of it. Like I said, I do find it very important there to be that distinction, because I don't think that people should be allowed to be excluded. But I would say that at least for my like internal subjective experience, it feels pretty similar.
The difference there is that, okay, like it probably goes unnoticed, I would think, most of the time.
Yeah.
If you're in the mall, like if somebody, decides they don't want you there, they can say something and the mall cops are going to show up and like try to make you leave or whatever.
Fuck the police coming straight from the underground.
But you're appealing to an owner, and to some degree, I think people are aware of the fact that if they choose to make like an argument and be like, no, I have every right to be here, that they're going to lose, and that they might end up being like arrested for trespassing, right? They're in a more precarious situation. In public, even like what happens is the owners have an other over them, and they have to contend with the fact that the big other is watching what they do. And this is what happens when like Starbucks decides to kick, people out of a Starbucks because they're black. Right? The big other recognizes what the manager of the private property does is inappropriate, and therefore Starbucks has to respond to that and try to, in a sense, like say we screwed up, we are going to let people use our bathrooms, so on and so forth, because there is that big other there, in a sense. And I think that when you get into true private property sorts of things, like a mall, where like I think a Starbucks in a mall is different than a Starbucks on a high street, basically, is kind of the argument I'm trying to make here, because of the way that the big other functions in those two environments. I do think it functions differently. I don't know if that tracks with the rest of you, but that's kind of my argument.
I don't know if this will help, but maybe possibly trying to break up this definition of public and private on, like, along the lines of like a Kantian distinction between public and private reason, right? I mean, not that referencing Kant generally makes things easier to understand, but hopefully in this case it will be easier to understand. But so basically, in a Kantian definition, public reason is something that is being used to determine or decide on an open-ended problem that concerns like lots of people, right? Or that kind of faces a populace. Whereas private reason is something of like a formality that determines how you interact to accomplish a task that's already been prescribed as being defined a certain way. So it's kind of like the difference between, like if you try to bring it into contemporary society, you got like this idea of like the mall versus like being out in the open, right? It's not so simple as just like being in one space or being in the other. It's about what your directives are in terms of like what you need to accomplish. Are you just operating upon the assumption that you maybe need to go buy something, you need to get some food, or you need to get some clothes, and so you're entering into a space with the intention of like, I have to accomplish this thing, and therefore I am operating under the premises of private reason, because there is pre-prescribed way that I'm supposed to go about doing this thing, and I don't have to employ my own faculties of like determining how to do it. It's pretty much laid out for me, and I just have to follow the steps. Versus we're facing a crisis and people are hurt or dying or something. We need to figure out what we're going to do or what we're going to implement collectively so that we can try to mitigate the pandemic, right? And like that would be a use of public reason, because you have to implement your faculties of reason that are not pre-prescribed to like be able to engage in that way with that problem. So maybe like that can help you just differentiate between public and private across a different axis. So it's not so, because it's I don't think it's so much. And also, I think in the argument of McGowan, I think he's kind of saying, this is sort of similar to what you had mentioned before about that sort of tripartite distinction, right? There's like the public and private space, but there's also like this idea of the commons, right? And those things aren't, like public and commons aren't the same thing, like you were saying before. And I think maybe in McGowan, he's kind of trying to say that capitalism is sort of collapsing the commons into the public in a strange way, or like destroying the commons, but not eliminating the obstacle of the public. So you don't have access to that space where you're supposed to be able to enter into and use those faculties of reason that you have, or come up with solutions for problems, right? Or like come up with, new definitions for the problems we already have. But rather you just have the obstacle of everybody else in your way, keeping you from getting what you want as an individual. So in a sense, it's forcing you into the realm of private thinking and seeing yourself as just like a man, as opposed to a part of a greater space or like some kind of public group, like a citizen, I guess you could say, or like a patriot. God forbid I use this terminology. Sounds fascist, I know, but anyway, I'm just saying.
Hitler took the guns. Stalin took the guns. Mao took the guns. Fidel Castro took the guns. Hugo Chavez took the guns. And I'm here to tell you, 1776 will commence again if you try to take our firearms.
I don't know if that helped, but
Let me ask you a question. So I feel like in this discussion so far, we're focusing on trying to define clearly within certain parameters what public means. But let's come at this a different way. What do you all mean whenever you say private? Like, what falls into the category of private life if we're going to be talking about that as a primary dichotomy in this chapter?
I feel like earlier you said something about you wanted to like bench some of this discussion for later when we're talking about security state and that kind of argumentation, right?
I mean...
I'm going to bring it up now anyway. So just saying, I know you said you wanted to say something, but for me, private is that thing that you feel is being threatened by, like, say the, NSA monitoring, my device that I carry on me at all times. Is the reason you put a little piece of tape over the camera on your laptop, right? Because someone might be looking into your private space, right? But simultaneously, it's the thing that you experience all the time, everywhere in capitalism, because there's really no public spaces. All the public spaces that like quote unquote public spaces that we enter into, if you got a pair of headphones in, it's your private space too. No one's going to tell you, unless you go to like a really fancy spot, no one's going to tell you can't wear your pajama pants to the store, especially right now, like we're in the middle of this pandemic. And like, I kind of feel like the things that I've witnessed in like what would normally be referred to as public spaces, right, are just, it's like people are just seeing the whole world as their living room. And I think when they imagine somebody spying on them, it's incredible, like where they feel like that private space extends to. That's kind of why I was trying to frame it more as like a way of thinking about something, or a way of like something having more to do with your intentions or your directives versus being like a physical space, because it's like our private and public are all bleeding in and out of each other all the time in capitalism, because I don't feel like there's really a truly well-defined public. It's more like anywhere that you can make private, you're going to try and make it private, and that just happens by you closing yourself off to the gaze of the other, or like, some way of kind of neutralizing the space that you interact with, so that you can have the safety of like your internal ideas and thoughts and not have to really sully that sense of privacy. So that would be my thoughts on it.
Neil, what do you think before I read some McGowan?
I think that the private is this stuff that if anybody intrudes on it, then they look like an asshole, right? Because that's your space.
Elegant.
So like, if somebody's like, I don't know, looking at their phone or whatever, and starts looking over their shoulder to like see what they're up to or whatever, you don't think that the person who's looking at their phone is doing something wrong. You think the person who's looking over their shoulder is doing something wrong. They're intruding on their private, whatever they're doing on their phone. If somebody goes into your mailbox and starts looking through your mail just because they're curious, they want to see what kind of mail you're getting, people are going to be like, no, you don't do that. That's like their private stuff. You can't do that. I wouldn't want anybody doing that to me, so I get uncomfortable when you look at somebody else's stuff that way, right? There's certain even topics of conversation that people tend to not broach because they're private, right? You just don't bring that up with somebody unless you have a very high level of familiarity with, and they've essentially given you permission to do that. But if you were to just go and you're standing in line at Home Depot or whatever, and there's somebody who you've never talked to, and you're going to say to them, so like, who's going to miss you when you die? What kind of kink are you into? You're not going to do that, because you'd be really fucking weird if you did. That's considered like private information that you shouldn't be asking about, right?
I can definitely attest that will get you very odd looks. I've been thrown out of multiple Home Depots for asking what people's kinks are.
So you're into wood.
So I'm gonna invoke some McGowan, and then I'm also
they're at Home Depot. They're there because they're into kink.
That's why I go to Home Depot. That's why I thought it was okay to ask people about it. Okay, I'm gonna invoke some McGowan, and then I'm also gonna invoke Roman society. So, I think that one of the most important things to understand about the development between public and private is that private are concerns and areas of concern that focus on the reproduction of life and the reproduction of the basic organizational biological units of society. Hence, I think everything that Neil just said, almost without exception, could be focused on things that fall into that realm of the private are things that are either about like reproduction of the family, biological, sexual sorts of gratification and desires, things like money, like how you spend money. Like a lot of the reason why people don't want you looking in their mail is because you might see like fucking their bank statements or their bills, like how much they're paying. I think there's a certain way that the economics and the sort of biological reproduction of the family is like a really core way that we defined what private is. So I think the difference between the public and like why we sort of get pissed off or we think the person looking over the shoulder is the asshole and not the person looking at their phone, because we all have this assumption that in public spaces, not commons necessarily, but in public spaces, we're here to essentially interact as homo economicus, or to interact as sort of these subjects who have a veil of like there's a certain part of my subjectivity that you're not allowed access to, because we already define that the nature of interacting publicly, like in Home Depot, is that you're not here to understand like my biological reproduction or what my values are, what my kinks are. It's like we're here to fucking shop. I got to go buy, that whatever it is, right? So, but I think that to me, that's still a really important distinction, is that public, especially in capitalism, public is the space where economic activity has to be conducted. And it demands that there's a certain walling off of public and private, because if you were to talk to someone about their kinks at Home Depot, they may not buy as much shit, or like, I mean, I would probably go to Home Depot.
Maybe buy more.
Or maybe they might buy more, right? So, but who knows? But I think it's like you're almost like hedging your bet that if we're not talking about kinks, then ideally you're probably, we don't want to disrupt economic activity. So to me, that's kind of part of how I think about public and private. And just so I can reference this really quick, this is on page 55. So this is where McGowan starts to talk about some people that we haven't talked about on the show, but are really important. The Italian political philosopher, Giorgio Agamben, and the eminent Jacques Ranciere.
Oh, yeah.
So he's kind of talking about how Arendt basically was critical of the way that the protection and reproduction of life, what Arendt calls labor, has invaded and subsumed the realm of politics. And then basically says blah, blah, blah about Agamben. But then there's this last piece in this paragraph I think is really important. The transformation of politics into private concerns about life and the body is the elimination of politics proper. My Latin is shit, but I'm going to assume is that home?
Yeah, okay. I mean, it might be home.
Oh, let's say
Latin.
So the om comes to replace the citoyen completely. And with the disappearance of the citoyen, we enter into a world dominated by privacy and bereft of public space. So I think that this is precisely the whole sort of Foucauldian Agamben sort of focus on like bare life and like biopolitics, is to say that things that typically were considered private around biological reproduction, about your body, about your sexuality, those things are now subsumed into the realm of of politics, and politics by definition is public. And so to me, that's kind of a place where you see this distinction about biology and reproduction and like economics of the home. To me, that's how I understand the distinction. Fucking facted it in the logic. So Don, what do you think about that?
Okay, well, there's a sentence I was going to bring out. I mean, honestly, like there's so much interesting stuff in this chapter, and if we've been talking about this for a lot, so if you guys just want to say like, fuck off, let's talk about something else, that's fine.
This is great. I'm liking this.
Okay. I think that this was like one of the sentences that like is kind of what led to my confusion or something like that, or to my trouble in trying to understand exactly when he means public and private, what he means. So this is on 52 again. This is our third full paragraph. He says, in other words, capitalism reverses the actual chronological relationship of public and private. The subject first comes into existence as a public being and subsequently establishes a private world in which it shields itself from the public and fantasizes its isolation from others. I guess like when I think of the subject first comes into existence as a public being, I'm not sure exactly what age he's thinking of this as, but to me I would have thought of actually like, at least when I think of public or private, I mean, I think of like the family. And so I would have thought of the subject as actually being situated within the private immediately. And there is, to me, there's like an interplay between them. There's the family, which is private. There's also something like very generalized, like language, which we could say is public. There's, for contemporary children, there's television, which is, I think we could maybe say, is some sort of even combination between, it's like public airwaves, and yet like private companies that are doing it. I don't know, like, I guess I just, like, when I read this, I was like, either he must be meaning public as just being like just other people just in general, or like, I don't think it's like that accurate to say that we come into existence as a public being and then only then establish the private. It seems like it would almost be a combination from the very beginning.
I mean, I don't disagree with that they kind of happen at the same time, right? Like, in fact, I think both of these things are so dependent on each other that, like, they, in a sense, they have to have come into existence or recognition from someone at the same time, right? But I think that before you recognize that you're doing so, right, the public appears as something that you are encountering as non-threatening, right? At first, I guess you might say, as something that like appears and just exists prior to you and you're just trying to make sense of. But then eventually there comes a point where you recognize yourself to have disagreements or thoughts that don't line up with what the public is presenting you with, right? And then there's some way that you identify that as like your private conclusions or your opinions or like however you want to put it. But at some point you kind of draw some line of boundary between like what you apprehend prior to feeling like you have any take on something, and then what you then understand about something that you want to present back to the public, or that you want to present as something that is different than what comes from the public. He goes on right after that passage that you read, he goes on to talk about Wittgenstein, and I think it's interesting that kind of how Wittgenstein is trying to define languages. It's like the impossibility of a private language, right? Like yeah, you take language into your own head and you have thoughts about it, and they may be unique to you, or they may be something that you find to be in contrast to what you experience in the world outside of you. But that language itself and its inherent possibilities for conclusions you could draw from it are public in themselves, and that nothing that you ever come up with through language can really be a description of something private. And I mean, it's kind of radical, but I think, that's an interesting way to think about it, because basically, like, my philosophical perspective is that what is public is always going to take precedence over what you consider to be private, even in ways you might not anticipate. So
that sounds like some Stalinist bullshit to me.
Oh yeah.
Neil, what do you think?
I won't deny it.
Like when Don was talking about this is on page number 63, where McGowan starts talking about the psychoanalytic session. He says the psychoanalytic session, and this distinguishes it more than anything else from other forms of therapy, occurs in a public space. Even though psychoanalysts don't typically go on television and give public accounts of their patients' private lives, the active analysis itself is public in the sense that it publicizes what the patient would prefer to have remain. In the active analysis, the patient confronts a public and articulates its desire through this confrontation. The analyst stands in for the desire of the public, and the subject discovers its desire through an encounter with this desire of the other. When I was reading this, this is one of those things where I found myself going like, I'm not so sure. I really want to think about this more. If that matches up with my own experience of analysis, like doing it as an analysand, doing it as an analyst, so on and so forth. And the jury's out for me right now. I'm not sure about this, because I think that one of the things that makes psychoanalysis what it is the fact that the patient comes in a lot of times, I think, with a transference that the analyst is sort of like an agent of the big other, and that the analyst or the therapist can fix them, cure them, and make them behave differently, right? That's something that can happen. And so they come into analysis with this demand that occur. And I think when analysis works well, what happens is people transition away from that demand, and they move to a desire. They move to desiring to understand why they do the things they do, why they want the things they want, why they repress the things they repress, so on and so forth. But for that to happen, I think analysis has to be maybe in this weird sort of space that is neither private nor public, that it exists in an overlap between these two areas. And I don't even know how to articulate this. I haven't thought this through very well. but that was weird for me. So like in the when you bring this up, this sort of like, what is private space? What is public space? I think it's a good question, especially insofar as it pertains to analysis. Where does analysis exist? Is it private space? Is it public space? And I want to think about that more as a result of reading this, and something that I probably think about for a while before I come up with any conclusions. I'll probably change my mind a few times, but I don't know what will happen here.
I dominated the time a little bit, so if we
No,
wanna...
I mean, I don't know. I feel like I'm trying to help in any way, like try to clarify, or because I think it's a productive question, like where can we draw that boundary? Once again, like I think that what we might consider to be private, like the world is a strange place, right? Like nowadays somebody will introduce themselves and tell you their pronouns, and maybe even they're like some very, very private things. It's almost like you might find someone who's like really old school and they just don't even, won't even look at you, like I guess it just depends. And there's I don't even know where I got this from, but like there was an interview, I think maybe Zizek said it or something one time, and I thought it was really, really interesting. There was an interview with Gore Vidal like a long time ago, obviously. And basically it was like, kind of speculated that Gore Vidal might have not been straight, but it was a little ambiguous, like whether or not he was gay or bi or something in between. And I think the interviewer basically like asked him like, what was your first sexual encounter? Was it with a man or with a woman? And Gore Vidal's answer was, I was too polite to ask, right? Which is like really nice. Zing. But I think I think that like it seems like something that it's really hard to come up with a definition for, right? Like what would you consider private versus what would you consider public? But I guess my question for you, Don, is what do you consider private? Not that I'm asking you to disclose your private life, but like, I mean,
Tell me
where
your
would you
kink,
draw that
Don.
boundary?
Well, yeah. I mean, part of when I and this is kind of what I was telling Adam and why he mentioned it was like, I generally, despite being on a podcast and talking probably too much, like I consider myself to be like a pretty private person. I'm like very particular about the information that people like know about me. I sometimes intentionally spread like disinformation about myself in order so people don't know things.
Skunk works, Don.
In our apartment, like when I'm at Adam's apartment, like he's got the blinds open all the time. And like I'm the type of person that likes to have the blinds closed like pretty much permanently, and so it's like there's just like all sorts of different ways that that I think of myself as like I love texting because it was like now nobody can like listen into like who I'm talking to and stuff. So I just feel like in a lot of ways like I like privacy, like I don't like people knowing things about me, even weird things. I don't know. So
I'm imagining Don going to Home Depot and buying PVC pipe and just telling people my sump pump is broken.
No, honestly, like when I'm at a store and people ask me why I'm buying stuff, I almost always make up something that is not true, even if it's completely innocuous.
I love it.
So yeah,
read it between the lines.
I love that we're talking about this on the fucking podcast right now. This is great. This is like real shit. This is getting real personal.
So, yeah.
Do you guys have sump pumps in Austin, Texas? Or is that like just a Midwest thing?
I think it's just a Midwest thing.
I don't know what that is.
Yeah, I mean, I've had them in places that I've lived, but yeah, it's usually like if your like basement gets flooded and stuff like that, you need to like pump the water out and shit. So.
Sure.
Yeah, not that I've lived in the Midwest.
Okay.
He may or may not have lived somewhere in the Midwest of the United States of America at an undisclosed time.
Allegedly.
ONG. So as you guys are talking about this, I don't know like how much time I want to spend in this chapter. I have a lot more stuff, but I'm gonna kind of skip to something that I thought I hope is interesting. This is something that like I read the chapter and I jotted this down as kind of like a note to myself. So I'm this isn't McGowan's words. These are mine. So absolutely like poke all the holes in them because I'm sure there's a lot here. What I think is really fascinating about this text is it kind of called to my attention the way that many people believe that they are sticking it to the other, that they're kind of like getting one over on the other, that they're more powerful than the other by protecting their private spaces, their private world, etc. And doing that by sort of dismantling and disempowering the commons and the public, the shared spaces that exist. And what I think actually happens, and this is what McGowan kind of helped me see, is that when we protect our private world at the expense of the public world, what we end up doing is empowering the other to a much greater degree than it would have been in power if we would have like let the public spaces continue to exist. what was public space where the subject had rights becomes private property, where the other and its agents can suppress the rights of those who gather on that private property. So the way that I kind of imagine this working is there's probably people who sort of spend a ton of their time, energy, effort, potentially money, trying to privatize things, and then so they have a company and they privatize the prison system and they get a lot of money, and then what happens, there's like a hostile takeover of their company, and now they don't have a job anymore. The thing that they were doing in an attempt to sort of like disempower the public, they thought that was empowering them, but what it's actually doing is making them much more vulnerable, much more precarious. And I think that that's really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, isn't that essentially the sort of perfect neoliberal subject is the one who basically says the degree to which I have power and agency is to the degree that I sort of can like police the boundaries of like what is mine privately and what is mine publicly. And I think that that's kind of the subversive sort of psychoanalytic move here that McGowan's trying to do. I think in our first discussion, my thing I kept coming back to and wanting to hammer on is that the whole point here is to sort of dethrone the commodity as sort of the structuring object or the structuring sort of experience of almost everything that we encounter, right? Whether it's romantic relationships or sort of like the things that we buy or like how we fashion ourselves. But I think that this is like, to me, really important. It's like if we start from the assumption that the self or the subject is inherently or sort of traumatically public as its beginning point, then essentially the degree to which someone then tries to sort of empower the private sort of aspects of their subjectivity is like to the degree that they are increasingly like becoming like a more perfect neoliberal subject in a way. Because in a sense, like the whole sort of basis by which capital can continue to sort of drive accumulation and to sort of stave off some fundamental crisis, and this is the whole shift in May 68 and the 70s through the 80s, is that we have to sort of redefine subjectivity as inherently almost like 100% private entity. Like that's kind of the ideological move that I think capital sort of exists on, especially now. And so, I mean, to me, I think that is like a really important thing. And I think it actually has like a really strong material basis. And I that's what I think is important to read this also like very materially, is to say that, yeah, has all these sort of like implications that we can talk about in terms of like psychoanalysis and psychology, but it's like, but there are like material shifts and sort of historical movement and trajectory that are like deeply, I think, material in terms of like economics and politics as well. So Neil, I don't know. I mean, I'm not sure if that's sort of kind of what you were thinking, but that's kind of what I hear thinking about like what is the impact and what is the purpose of sort of why we kind of lean more and more towards the private as like a way to sort of feel like we get one over on the big other. At least we protect ourselves, or it like gives us a sense of agency more than we feel that we do.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I was going to say, even sorry, Neil, did you have something? Go ahead if you got something.
No, go for it, dude.
Looking ahead a little bit in the next chapter, I know McGowan starts talking about maybe the direction that he's headed in terms of like why he's making such a point about what the private space really consists of versus the public space, in the sense that, you know, he's going to start attacking capitalism as masquerading as like a neutral entity, a space that is just sort of appears and doesn't have any biases or like any necessarily like intentions of its own, but rather exists as like a mechanical / neutral space that we interact with as individuals, right? Or as subjects, and he's going to start kind of trying to pick apart that idea of capitalism as a neutral space, or like the neutral functioning of like economy and politics, you know, that we engage with voluntarily and can enter in and out of that kind of space. So in terms of like direction, that's definitely something that's the next thing that he addresses, insofar as we basically have fully confused ourselves as far as like what private actually
Hell
means.
Yeah.
That might actually be good, because if what McGowan I think ultimately wants to do is to try to kind of attack this whole structure and how it's laid out, and sort of pick apart why it can't be that way.
Yeah, I mean, I thought it might be interesting to talk a little bit about, I don't mean to jump us ahead if anybody had any other comments about what Alex said, but in talking about this public and private distinction and kind of arguing for the, like on the public side, I was trying to remember if there's a section in which he really goes and talks about, like, I mean, obviously I have like my own, you know, I very much would prefer public spaces to private, because there are things like in the private, you basically have an undemocratic form of power that's able to be exercised. So to me, that's one of my main concerns. Is there like a different concern that McGowan has specifically related to psychoanalysis in arguing against the privatization of these spaces?
I would say yes.
Yeah,
so
do you want to pull that out a little bit?
The last point I wanted to make here before we get into chapter 3.
Okay.
Again, I could probably talk about 2 for a lot longer, but this is definitely getting into the psychoanalytic weeds a lot. If I go too deep into those weeds, I'm going to need somebody to tell me you've lost sight of me and to back it up a little bit here. One of the things that I don't think that is really explained in this chapter, something that I brought to the chapter as I was reading it, is the Lacanian distinction between neurotics and psychotics. It's alluded to. McGowan does make some pretty good things here. Like at one point, this is I think on 61, neurosis is understood by psychoanalysis as nothing other than the price that the subject pays for its submission to the demands made by the social order. The neurotic symptom emerges out of the subject's refusal to submit completely. I remember reading this, and one of the things that, one of the more difficult, I think, concepts for me anyways, to grapple with in Lacan is the concept of the real. And if anybody wants to jump in and talk about that at some point, feel free to interrupt me here. But I associate the real with the fact that our bodies die, that we age, diminish, and die, and so do all the people that we love and care about, and that we don't know what happens after the body dies. Some people like to believe that they know what happens, but ultimately that's a matter of faith. It's not a matter of fact. We don't know. And that's the real is the thing that castrates, that it's the ultimate castrator. Death castrates us completely. We have a limited amount of time to do all of the things that we want to do, and we're not going to be able to do them all. One of the things that the neurotic does is they cover over the real, they cover over the castration of the real by submitting to certain things, and they make a deal. They're like, I'll follow the rules to a certain point, and if I do that, then I'll be protected from castration. That's the way they look at it. They engage the other and sort of say hey, is there a way we can come to some sort of reasonable arrangement here? And then they're always attempting to kind of find a loophole in the arrangement that they make. The psychotic, on the other hand, is somebody who just forecloses the very idea of castration. For them, the real is not real. It's not there, right? They believe that it doesn't castrate them, or that there's a way for it not to castrate them. I think that there's a lot of people that, whether they realize they're doing this or not, this is kind of a huge thing in Lacanian theory and in a lot of other, I think, parallel theories like Deleuze and Guattari talk about this quite a bit as well. It's the idea that capitalist societies produce more psychotics, and pre-capitalist societies or societies really before the end of World War II produced more neurotic subjects. There was more stable institutions. There was more of a public previous to the end of World War II and the sort of ramping up of capitalism and the way that it's ramped up. So in Freud's era and stuff, there's a lot of neurotics produced, and now in the era we're in now, there's a lot of psychotics produced because capitalism encourages people to engage in the psychotic belief of non-castration. Ultimately, that they can do what they want, when they want, how they want, as long as they have enough money and stuff like that. So, I think that's a really important thing it was reading this chapter with that in mind, I think changed the way that I read it and all that. So anyways, like I said, I know I was deep into the weeds about stuff, so I'll stop talking now and let people say whatever.
So can I ask you a question about this, Neil, and we can maybe touch on a specific McGowan quote? So I'm on the bottom of page 60. I found this discussion about the sort of advent of consumer society post-World War II as actually a really important one, and I'm wondering how this relates to sort of bringing in this sort of emphasis on neurotics versus psychotics, and how maybe prior to sort of the advent of consumer society and after World War II and the sort of increasingly privatized sort of space and all this other shit, I'm wondering how we could connect this. So, okay, this is on 61, right before the subtitle or the subheading, The Public Obstacle to Privacy. McGowan says, as capitalism has developed, it has not only emphasized consumption as an economic mode of overproduction, but it has also increasingly convinced subjects that they could attain the lost object, which has augmented hostility to the public world, the site of necessary loss. As subjects invest themselves in the ideal of unlimited satisfaction, the possibility of a public gradually disappears. The public world depends on subjects who recognize that their satisfaction depends on the encounter with the obstacle of otherness. So what I'm wondering is
is part of what creates more psychotics in the way you're describing it, Neil, precisely because with the advent of consumer society, the de-engagement from the public as a place where necessary loss is part of what you're almost like compromising with. Like, you're more neurotic because you have to like somehow reckon with the fact that there is loss. Like, I'm not going to be able to fully have everything that I want, so I have to compromise. But with the advent of consumer society, it becomes easier to be psychotic because in a way you never have to encounter necessary loss. It's easier to sustain the idea that, well, I can actually have all the satisfaction I want because I have 25 different colors of KitchenAid stand mixers that I can buy. And that'll certainly grant me the satisfaction that I truly desire. So I'm wondering if that's kind of, again, like a material way to connect the dots here, that part of this, what might seem like something in the psychoanalytic weeds is actually really fucking material. And I actually think it's pretty easy to track, of like a particular kind of subjectivity that arises from one kind of mode of capitalism to a shift in subjectivity that kind of matches more with another, if that makes sense.
It so does, dude. This is Seminar 20 stuff, big time.
Yeah.
Where Lacan, I think, really susses out the difference between phallic jouissance or male jouissance and female jouissance. So to try to say this succinctly, when we're in the public, what I think we're recognizing is that I am castrated and you are castrated and everybody else around us is also castrated. We've all lost the lost object. We all don't have the phallus. We all are missing that, but we're all missing it together, right? And because we all are missing this thing, we have to cooperate in order to have some sort of semblance of a life that doesn't suck, right? That's the idea there. Phallic jouissance, which it matches more up with this idea that I was describing as psychosis, is the idea that I haven't lost the object. I have the phallus. I don't need to compromise. I don't need to cooperate. I don't need to share with others because I am non-castrated. And I think what capitalism does is it encourages people to believe that they either are or could be, if they made enough money, non-castrated subjects. And so people pursued that. They're pursuing the phallic object, the lost object, the thing that will give them the power to be non-castrated, to be whole and complete, and not wanting it all. Where people who exist in the public recognize that they're missing something. Like, I can't give myself all of the things that I need. I need somebody else to give me the things that I lack. And in order for them to do that, I'm going to have to like behave in a way that doesn't discourage them from doing so. I'm going to have to be a public subject in a sense. That is a better way to be in many ways.
Yeah, I think that there's on the bottom of 63, there's a good quote that I think kind of explains kind of what's at stake here. It also raises some questions I'm going to have. But anyway, so he says, rather than seeking an object in this world and retreating with the object into one's private oasis, one must embrace the public world as the site of the obstacle. Without the public qua obstacle, the subject would lose its ability to satisfy itself, which is why capitalism's hostility to the public world itself is not sincere. So I think that that's, at least to me, it seems like kind of what was at stake for like why this distinction between public and private is really important. I would say that this sentence is another one that like that brings up those questions that I had. I don't think we need to rehash them, but let me just kind of explain where some of them was. Like when he says like retreating into the object into one's private oasis, when I think of the public, there's part of it that's like, when I think of the private, there's part of it that can retreat into your own oasis. But there's also part of it, if we think of everything being privatized, will also be like caught in other people's like basically private hell. Like if I go to, like a mall, then it's like not my own space, it's somebody else's space, and it's probably pretty shitty.
Shots fired at malls.
Yeah. But like, and I guess that this is kind of what I was trying to ask, and I probably did a really poor job of it earlier, is like, me going into somebody else's private space, like a mall, wouldn't that also present like an obstacle? And what would be the difference between me, that being an obstacle in the private and there being an obstacle in the public?
Think of it maybe this way. So there's a difference between like what Americans call like a bar and maybe what was a public house in a different day and age, right? So a public house is a place where the public gathered to do public things, to discuss stuff and, I don't know, enjoy themselves, whatever. And when you were in the public house, you had to conduct yourself in a certain way, because if you didn't, like you to earn the ire of the public, and that would be bad for you. It would have a negative impact on you. That had nothing to do necessarily with your consumption, your buying power and stuff. I mean, that could influence it too, but it's not necessarily that. Where in private spaces, it really, everything kind of comes back down to you as an individual and your identity. I'm doing a terrible job of explaining this, but I think what I'm trying to suggest here is that in public spaces, cooperation is an essential component of the experience of the public. And in private spaces, cooperation is not inherently a experience of it. It can exist. You can cooperate in private spaces, but it doesn't have the same sort of necessity as that it has when you're in a public space. You have to cooperate in the
Is there like in a sense in which it's like in the private spaces that like antagonism or obstacle is against essentially one person, the person who is in control of that space, versus in the public, that obstacle is in the form of like a collection of like a larger society or a larger culture or something like that I exist within.
Can I take a stab at this?
Yeah. Sorry.
So one thing that I think reading this particular section is important to remember is that we have to start with the idea that the structure of desire, we experience satisfaction precisely through the fact that it is sort of like limited and barred from us in a particular way. So I think this is like a really key Lacanian point, is that the like enjoyment and satisfaction is always like built upon the idea that it has certain like really strict restrictions around how it's going to be satisfied, or that there's something that's a barrier to it. And this is kind of a really interesting, but I think kind of counterintuitive point, is that it is only whenever you have something barred from you that like then gives you the structure to enjoy or like have satisfaction in the first place. So I think that what you have to start from is the idea that whether it's public or private, your desire is structured that way inherently from the get-go. The difference is that whenever you're in your private space, even if you're like ordering shit on Amazon, you are sort of like removed, or it sort of like distances you with the idea of the thing that is in itself the barring of your satisfaction, or the thing that is barring your desire. Because it's like it allows me to just interact only with commodities day in and day out, right? But the thing is, the reason why desire is barred for you inherently is because it's the desire of the other. And if I'm just interacting with commodities, like I don't ever really have to encounter that. But if I'm in a public space where I'm interacting with the gaze and the voice and the bodies of other people and wanting things from them and desiring them, or them desiring me, or whatever it is, like, and needing to satisfy certain things, I think it like you have to reckon with the fact that it's barred from you much more radically than engaging with the commodity, because it's like another fucking subject that's interacting with you. And I see that to me is kind of how I think about how those are shaped differently in the public and the private, and why the public one is so much more radical, because you aren't reduced to just having to understand your desire as being from commodities. It's then about subjects.
Okay.
And that's why you could also think of it as almost like that would be the realm of production, right? Like I'm like with other people and like in this sort of space where I'm now engaging with other like subjects that are radically like unknown to me. Like I can never really know if what you want is what you want, or if what you're saying is like I can interpret that correctly, or if you mean the same thing that I mean. It's like there's a sort of radical like kind of traumatic cut, because you're constantly being forced to like have to reckon with the fact that like you're always barred from being completely satisfied. But again, if I have that sky blue KitchenAid stand mixer, I maybe don't have to encounter it that way.
Yeah, I was just going to say that. That's, I think how it's being presented is kind of like that private space is something that capitalism in its contemporary incarnation is pushing you toward, because rather than engaging with that radical space of like the lack of knowledge of like what the other desires from you, you can recede into this space where you get a false sense of not having to engage with the public, right? Because supposedly in your own private space, you're liquid, right? Like you can just move to whatever it is that you desire and accomplish it and be satisfied by it. Of course, that's impossible, right? Like the structure of desire itself, like Adam was just saying, is something that's always going to have that non-completeness or whatever. It's always going to give you the dissatisfaction of not being complete. But like that's why, maybe to put it in terms that Neil presented earlier, that's why the more contemporary incarnation of capitalism is creating more psychotic subjects, right? Because a psychotic subject is the one that makes themselves the object. And so we could even maybe think about this in a more Marxist way, or like, looking towards the future of some of the things that are come up in the future chapters, but like the commodification of your own subjectivity in a sense, right? Instead of seeing the commodity as something that is going to be an obstacle or something that can get you closer to a part of yourself, you rather abandon, maybe backtrack a second, what Neil was talking about earlier about the real, and he was kind of saying it's like this encounter with the unknowability of like what lies beyond in death. Well, I think you could conceive of it of like as the thing that you were at before you encountered language. So like language thrusts you into the kind of world that you have to like now engage with constantly, and you're always inside of its like boundaries, and you can't accomplish anything without engaging with that thing through language, right? And so whatever thing, right, you imagine there to be beyond language that you originated from, right? You always cast some kind of fantasy in that place, right? They vary, but like in some sense, there's always this point of reference that you can imagine that exists like prior to language, or that you were in prior to language. So you could think of that as being something that you have to constantly contend with in your subjectivity, as like, what will get me closer to that? Right? What will get me out of this mess that is language that never allows me to like express myself fully? Well, the psychotic subject just says, no, this is perfect, right? Like I can completely abandon any relation to that place that existed before and just make myself, like I can fall into the image, right? Like I can just be what I know everybody sees me as, and then have no fidelity or no tender to that thing that I originated from, and I can just fully objectify myself. And like because they believe in that way, they're like, they're manipulators, they're people who don't respect boundaries of other people, like things like that, right, come from having no sense of like mutual connection to that kind of neuroticism that most people share, this like being castrated that we all have, right? And so, in that sense, right, maybe you could think of it as capitalism as being something that falsely pushes you into a sense of like, you can just be an object too. Wouldn't it be simpler, right? Like stop worrying about like what kind of things you may owe to the public or what kind of debts or responsibilities you feel like you may have. Like just accept that like all you need to do is just exchange commodities. Hell, you're one already. Right? So just move in that direction. It's easier.
It's what Erich Fromm called the marketplace self. That was essentially like what his critique was of what it was to be a subject. It's like, you now just become the commodities that you're purchasing. You fashion yourself in a certain way so you can be more desirable to others in the market.
Sure. I think that the other way to think of this too is that when you're in the public, like if you're not engaging in phallic jouissance, what you're enjoying is your castration, and you're enjoying it because you're among other castrated subjects. Right? The psychotic, somebody could be miserable. It could be like, oh my gosh, I'm lacking. I don't have the thing that will bring me satisfaction. I'm not going to get it. That's awful. I'm tortured. Oh my God. And part of the reason that people might believe that is they think that somebody else actually does have the thing that they desire. Well, the cool thing about the public and the way that I think McGowan is describing it here is it's the space within which we start to recognize that not only are we lacking, but so is everybody else. And so we can connect with other people in our lacking. We can connect with the fact that I don't have the thing that I want. You don't have the thing that you want. Neither of us have the thing that we want. So we can kind of like commiserate on that. And we can be miserable because we don't have the thing that we want, but we can be miserable together, which is enjoyable in a way. So I don't know if that makes sense or not.
Let me tag on a McGowan quote. Very last line, bottom of 63. But the subject has the ability to recognize the public obstacle to the realization of its desire as the source of its satisfaction.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Oh, yeah! We need the public to enjoy our castration. Maybe is the most succinct way to sum up this chapter, I think, right? Like if we don't have the public, our castration is really unbearable. We're alone in what Don, I think you referred to it as our private hell of, I don't have the thing that I want. But in the public, we can share our castration, have other people share their castration with us in a way that is kind of interesting and fun. I mean, like we're doing that, I think, right now, right? I mean, we're doing this podcast, and to some degree, we don't understand different things. We're trying to understand it. So since we're trying to understand it, we don't, but we don't understand it together. And that's more interesting than just reading this book and being like, totally got it. I don't need to discuss this because it was totally understood by me, or thinking like, I don't get it, so there's nobody I can share this not getting it with. But we need this sort of public space that we're doing this podcast in to enjoy that castration in the way that we can.
Hey, Neil, I'm wondering, just to sort of think about that in a different way for myself, would you say that symbolic castration is really the friends we made along the way?
Symbolic castration is the people you meet in line at Home Depot.
That works too. I like that. Very good.
There's some other points in this that I thought were kind of interesting. But before I get to them, there was an example I wanted to bring up, because when I was reading this, I thought of it. When I was in my late adolescence and early 20s, there was a place that I think exemplified this public space, even though it wasn't like a public space, but it exemplifies it for me. And that was Denny's in the small hours of the morning. So like, I was the kind of person that would find themselves at Denny's when I was like 18 years old, probably starting sometime around like 10 or 11 at night or something. Like I'd work or whatever until 9 or something, and I'd go there to get something to eat. And the thing is, like, that's where everybody interesting ended up. Like there was all these people who were in essence like extremely castrated subjects. They were people who had a hard time fitting in maybe other places. They wore a lot of black clothing. They played Dungeons and Dragons. They were the people. There was like the making out club, and there was the not making out club, and this is like the not making out club meeting place, kind of, right? And so I think what I experienced in this weird kind of like collection of people in that space was this group of people who felt really lonely and oftentimes extremely sad and maybe even depressed because they felt so lonely, because they felt like misunderstood, like they just couldn't fit in anywhere, and it sucked. But then they found themselves with all these other people who had their own version of that, right? They had their own version of not fitting in, their own version of loneliness, and how that was affecting them. And then it's not like the loneliness went away. The loneliness continued to be a part of my life, their lives, other people's lives. But we were lonely with other people who were lonely. And that was a way of sharing castration. That was a way of sharing our lack with each other, we wouldn't have been able to do that, I think, if we didn't have sort of like the space within which to do it ultimately. And it was Denny, so like there were some people who showed up there and they didn't buy anything, right? They would just kind of like show up, and either you'd buy them something or they would just kind of like hang out at your table, and the servers didn't care, because they were bored or whatever. That's sort of my way of understanding McGowan's version of a public space, and what a public space can do for the subject if they kind of are able to enter it. Nowadays, I mean, when people don't have, their own version of Denny's to go to, where they can have that kind of an experience, the impact that has, I think, on subjectivity is really negative. And that's the thing that I think pushes people away from a kind of like collective neurosis towards a individualized psychosis that's probably really bad for them, probably really bad for others as well. So that's my thing. I don't know what you all think about that.
Hey, Neil, can I actually share something really personal with you that you just really kind of hit home for me that I've never really thought about this way? It's funny because like one of my favorite things in the world to do, is to go to a coffee shop and read with my headphones in. And it's not any coffee shop. Fucking hate Starbucks. Fucking hate all those like major corporate ones. But in our city, there are like all these like little like very just like hipster ass or like, crust punk coffee shops where everyone goes. Yeah. There's one in particular that we have all frequented quite a bit. And, and it's funny because I remember like moments in my life feeling intensely sad and intensely alone. And I remember like no matter what, I always had to go to that coffee shop. I'm like, I don't have anything else to do. I'm sitting in my apartment. I feel fucking terrible, but I have to be somewhere. I just can't be here. And I found I always went to that coffee shop. And whenever I look back on it, I'm like, I don't know why this place draws me so much. And I think like what you're describing at Denny's is actually kind of like the experience that I had there, because it's pretty obvious that everyone there is kind of like a weird fucking vagabond. I mean, I met some of those interesting people there. I mean, some of our like friends who are like have been on the show before I met there. But I think there's this experience where it's really obvious that that place, like, it feels very alluring, I think, for people who find that they don't feel like they fit in for whatever reason in different sorts of like quote unquote, you know, normal society, right? And that's the appeal of the place. Like, a lot of like political radicals go there, like a lot of anarchists hang out there. It's an anarchist book shop, like not too far away. But I think like whenever I keep asking myself, like, why is it that that place feels so good, but whenever I'm there, I don't want to talk to anybody. Like, I don't want to interact with you. I want to sit there and read with my headphones in, but I want to be around that kind of a space. And I think this is exactly what you're talking about, because it's like, I know that I feel incredibly, intensely, brutally castrated in this moment. I feel alone, I feel sad, I feel depressed, whatever. And yet there's somehow like being in a space and having this like intuitive feeling that other people probably are drawn to that space for a similar reason. Even though we're not interacting, the fact that we're together in that space always felt weirdly comforting, even if it never took away like the feeling of being sad and alone. And I still go there. I mean, if I can, I would go to that place. If I'm like, don't have anything else to do, I'm by myself, I'm like, I want to go and like, I'll take 2 or 3 books and I'll just hang out there as long as I can and I'll read. And I won't really even talk to anybody. But fuck if it doesn't make me feel weirdly at home in a certain way.
I feel like I'm just gonna chime in because we're all telling stories about how alone we are and shit. So
real lonely, real sad hours.
Real
big
lonely
sad, big sad on McGowan Part 2 tonight.
But yeah, no, I actually had an interestingly similar experience. I went from, this was long ago in my life when I was much, much younger, but I was like still too young to go drink at a bar, you know, or like do fully adult things. But I was old enough to where I didn't want to spend any time in my own house, and I was always wanting to be with other people. Well, so I didn't have very many friends. So I would either have my very small group of like, you know, sad boy lonely hour friends. Then we would go to like IHOP or Denny's, like you were talking about, Neil. And you know, we'd go there and, you know, we'd commiserate and we'd order like one coffee and, you know, sit there for hours and hours until we like couldn't keep our eyes open anymore, and then we'd all like part ways and go home. And I definitely remember that being fulfilling in a certain kind of way, but I think that there was still a degree to which it wasn't spontaneous enough, and so it just felt like the same shit I had all the time, because I was still kind of like bubble boying myself. What can I say? Like I still had like a boundary of like my own friends and my own familiarity around myself at that place, to where I wasn't actually experiencing the world as such. And so like on the off days though, I moonlit right, as like a loner, and I would like go to Walmart. It was my favorite thing to just go to Walmart and not buy anything, but just wander around and just go from aisle to aisle and like look at all the stuff, you know, like just like the fascination of just like, who buys this shit? Like this, just, they have so much stuff. We have like an enormous Walmart where I lived, and the lights were so bright, you know, like you could be like falling asleep and walk in there, and then it was like, oh, it's like daytime again and I'm fine and I'm awake again. And so you just like walk around and just stare at all the stuff, right? And, you know, it was just the sprawl of capitalism, I guess. But it wasn't until actually, like, I went back and forth between these two states a lot, right? And it wasn't until I actually encountered like what Adam's talking about, where it wasn't just me being alone with my like close little group of friends that we all knew we were all alone, and it wasn't just like me alone and like tempting, you know, tempting the public space with like, I'm alone, is anybody gonna, you know, is anybody here, you know, and like but like it was me going to like one of those coffee shops, you know, these like small coffee shops we have in town, and wanting to be alone just with myself, you know, like it was very strange. Like I was alone all the damn time, or at least I felt like it when I was with my family, when I was with my friends, when I was at Walmart staring at the shelves with the commodities.
Yeah, real you know, sad hours.
always alone. But it wasn't until I decided to go somewhere and be alone with myself that I actually found myself open to having a conversation with somebody else. When I went to IHOP and Denny's with my friends, and I feel like this is maybe different than your experience there, Neil, because like I was just surrounded by people I already knew, and there's nothing really spontaneous about it. We were just going there to kill time because there was nowhere else that was open at that time. But like going there, it was always the same conversations we always had, same subjects we always talked about, same people we knew. Walmart, it was silence. No one approaches you. You know, it's like it's like a bunch of cats walking around alleys, you know, like they all try to avoid each other, and it's the middle of the night and everybody's wondering why they're here. And then it wasn't until I was at that coffee shop and then I was like, okay, I'm here to like just do something, you know, I'm here to read, I'm here to just have a nice coffee, stare at the wall, you know, bring a magazine or just do something like a journal so I can do some art or something. And then it would be like those moments when I would have a spontaneous conversation and I would meet somebody like Adam or like Don that I just like hit it off with and was like, holy shit, like, and then now we're friends, like, you know, whatever, however many years later.
Yeah, long time. Yeah,
it is a little bit different in a sense that like with the Denny's that I would go to, there was people there that like I would hang out with them, but I wouldn't have like hung out with them outside of that space. There was like a weird libertarian dude who like, you know, like wore a lot of black and listened to Nine Inch Nails and stuff, and like would also talk to you about you know, libertarianism and try to like convert you to that way of thinking. And like this is not somebody who I would have like invited out to like my house, or I wouldn't have gone to their house. Like we met at Denny's because we knew the same people, and because we knew the same people, we ended up interacting with each other in a way that I'm positive I wouldn't have otherwise. There was you know, people who were really into like weird new age chakras and stuff that I wouldn't have talked to if I wasn't at Denny's, because I would have no reason to seek them out. They would have no reason to seek me out. We would avoid each other probably. But again, we knew the same people. Like this girl who was like into chakras and crystals was dating this dude who I knew and was kind of friends with. And so like I ended up, out of respect for him, like treating her like I was interested in what she was saying, you know, in a sense, right? And she probably did some version of that for me. This was the public, right? Going through this made it so that, like, one, I was around some people who were very similar, like, kind of like subjective composition as me. We believed a lot of the same stuff, liked a lot of the same stuff, all that. But I was also around people who were not like that. And part of the thing is to be around some of the people that I liked, I had to also be around some of the people who maybe I didn't like as much or didn't like at all. Like there was this one dude who would come in, and anytime you'd say something, he would like one up you. Like you'd say something about how you were stuck in traffic, and he'd be like, "Oh, there's this time I was stuck in so much traffic that I died," you know, or whatever. And everything. he was so annoying.
The most traffic.
But we did this thing once where that guy, we knew he was going to show up at some point. We're like, okay, when he shows up here, let's make up a story that he can't top. And so we made up the story about how this other guy, whose name was Mike, was driving in a subdivision and he sneezed. And when he sneezed, it was at the exact moment a kid ran into the road chasing a ball and he hit the kid and killed him. And the reason he wasn't in jail was because a sneeze is an act of God. And you can totally get off if you ever kill a kid using the sneeze technicality.
What?
Which this guy had done. So we just like made this thing up, and then we told it this guy, and it was like he didn't have anything. We felt really accomplished, right? But I would never have had that experience if I wasn't in this weird ass space. You see what I'm saying? Like, this is taking castration and making it work for you.
That's like level 7,000 to fucking 9,000 skunkworks meal right there. Like just spread disinformation.
So
I killed a kid on a technicality.
Okay, so I'm gonna
really good about that.
Sneeze, you close your eyes. You can't be held responsible.
Can't help it, man. Yeah,
yeah, because everything is just purely in the hands of God at that point. That's absolutely how that works. So
Jesus, take the wheel.
Yeah, I feel like kind of not because I think that there isn't. I'm actually really enjoying this. I'm glad this is going out on the episode. This is like kind of amazing to me that we're found our way to this point of the discussion. But I do want to actually try to offer something that this really makes me think about a really serious, like, theoretical topic in a new way. So whenever I think about Badiou's idea of the event and the sort of like truth procedures, particularly around romantic love. You know, I was watching a video of him. It was like a short film made where it's just basically Badiou talking about romantic love, right? And he's just basically kind of laying out his basic philosophy of like the event and how that relates to like romantic love whenever you encounter it, right? Mm-hmm. But there is a certain way that, like, one of the things he said that really struck me is he basically says that in a sense, like, for the event to happen, there has to be risk. There has to be some element of contingency or something that like pushes you out of like what your normal world is. That sometimes like events happen whenever like two worlds meet that normally like wouldn't meet. Mm-hmm. Now, I know that you probably didn't necessarily date like the young woman who was into like chakras and all that bullshit, right? But like I think there's a degree to which like putting yourself in that kind of space like allows like worlds to meet. And I mean like worlds in like the theoretical sense of how Badiou uses it. Yeah. And I think that there's something that, at least in the realm of interpersonal relations, like that's actually a really, really powerful and important thing. And the more that you retract yourself into the private space and just only interact through commodities or whatever, it's like you're sort of barring yourself from having that sort of risk and contingency of having to encounter like different like logical worlds. So I actually think you all are going to fucking hate me for this, and I don't blame you for it. But I think this is precisely why the figure of the Karen is so
damn it,
is such like a focal point of like criticism about like white affluent like upper middle class sorts of like subjectivity, right? Because the Karen is the one who goes into the store and like berates like the fucking minimum wage like sales clerk and is like, let me talk to your fucking manager, like whatever has happened in this realm of like at least to some degree risk and contingency, because I'm now surrounded by other people and something pissed me off. It's this idea of like the public space has to operate by the private standards that I have. I can't be inconvenienced. My desire can't be subverted or sort of like, you know, like disrupted in any way by other fucking people or for like something not working out the way that I want to. And I think to a certain degree, it's like that's like the embodiment of this subjectivity where everything is collapsed to private. It's like there can be no barriers to my enjoyment. And the second that there is a barrier, I'm going to react with this sort of like vitriol and fucking venom at whoever it is I think is disrupting my enjoyment. Usually the young sales clerk who is just like, what the fuck is this lady's problem? But I do think that there's a certain way that like this idea that everything should function exactly how I want, I should be able to predict it, I should be able to understand it, is like something that removes you from not only like your enjoyment being barred by the fact that we're all castrated together, but also potentially by like an event in the realm of like the interpersonal, which I know Badiou would say it has to be romantic love, but like to some degree I think there's like an element of dare I say platonic love that I think might also have like an eventual like truth dimension to it as well. So all right, listen, that might be one of the most insane coke fueled rants I've ever gone on this entire podcast. Is
Karen are people violating Karen's nap? Is this like is Karen? Are you saying Karen is like a radical libertarian subject?
Yeah, I'm absolutely saying that. I think that is exactly how it's experienced, right? That's why like the response from the Karen is so violent, like symbolically violent, right?
She just sees all things as her property.
So actually, you bring up a great point, and Neil, this connects to the libertarian guy you were talking about.
Yep.
Because in a sense,
that guy is now Karen.
Yeah, because for the libertarian, for my enjoyment to be disrupted, it's an aggressive violation of like my space and my subjectivity and my property. Like I absolutely think that's why the Karen is in a sense reacting as if everyone is violating the nap. Because in a sense they are, because the thing that you're disrupting most effectively is my enjoyment, and my enjoyment is purely private. Yeah. Like I absolutely think that's what's going on.
The world is my space of enjoyment.
Exactly.
You're violating it by being the public obstacle to.
I think that's exactly it.
Interesting.
Why do you? I've never heard of the Karen. Where
it's a meme.
It's a meme, but it's a really important one. It's sort of like the upper, like relatively like middle class, like upper middle class, like white woman who typically like wears. CC Alex is going to pull up a picture.
She always has like the bob haircut, like like the short haircut, you know, and like always basically just like goes into a store and. If anything is not up to her like 100% specifications, then she has to talk to the manager.
Yeah,
things like that.
Yeah, here I got a picture of Karen here. Right here, I'll just show you the Google image results. Those are pretty accurate, I would say.
Neil, can you see that?
I get it. Yeah.
Yep. You see, that's the one. Yeah. Let me talk to your manager, Karen.
Yeah. Let me talk to your manager.
And
sorry, I just saw a meme the other day that was someone like ranting on Twitter about like Bernie or something, and it was just like, is this Karen asking to speak to Capitalism's manager? That was pretty great. I mean, in a sense, that's what we're doing as hysterical Marxists. We're asking capitalism to speak to its manager.
We're all Karen. On the inside, we're all Karen. No, okay, but so like
this has evolved considerably.
I'm glad that because I wanna. So I mean, I'm not trying to say we got to conclude here, but in a sense, I am.
But you are.
Because I need to go talk to the manager. But I'm glad that you brought up Badiou, and I'm glad that we're talking about that in particular because the next chapter goes right into a discussion of Badiou and his perspective on economy in capitalism. And so I think that's it's a nice point where we can stick a fork in this shit.
When the event hits just right.
We need to add sneezes to events.
Add sneezes.
Oh, yeah, that's right. Yeah, that'd be the act of God. Yeah, I mean, that is absolutely a truth event.
Sure,
Fuck yeah.
Done.
All right, done. Truth, politics, aesthetics, romantic love, politics,
Science.
And science,
Yes.
and then sneezes. So we got 5 now.
It's 2 S's and it spells slap.
Like
Sneezes, science, love, politics, art. Or I messed up the words, the letters
right.
there.
Yeah,
But
we got
you
it.
can make it into slap.
That'll be our new Vanguard Party acronym, too. As the patron saint of Red Library would say, the macho man, Randy Savage, nothing means nothing, yeah! How'd you like them real sad boy hours today? We did not expect to go there, but damn, I'm really glad we found our way to that spot in particular. You know, I think it really brings out some of the more personal connections we have to reading all this theory, this particular approach of the Marxist/Lacanian psychoanalytic framework, you know, because this stuff really helps us make sense of our basic phenomenological experience of day-to-day life. And, you know, also helps you understand the ideological function of the Karen. All right, next week, it's a little bit up in the air what you can expect on your next Red Library episode. It might be a cross-posting with an excellent comrade from a new podcast that we have not collaborated with before, so you might get that. Maybe you'll get part 3 of Capitalism and Desire, or maybe you'll get something from our Revolutionary Politics in Central and South America series. We'll see how it goes. You're probably going to get all 3 of those in some order, just not sure which yet. All right, let's go out the way that we always do. Remember to stay hydrated, stay motivated, stay liberated. Keep searching for ways to be emancipated. Keep looking for those lost futures in the rubble, in the wreckage, wherever you find it. Keep gazing for that dialectically pessimist utopian horizon. And as Ernst Bloch said, sometimes we need to use this utopian thinking to pierce through the thing that is actually directly in front of us, because it is so obscured by the forces at work happening right now. We'll see you back here next week, as always, on Sunday evening. And if you feel alone, if you're also having some real sad boy hours, just remember, we out here. And maybe we're in that same coffee shop that you are, reading that book, dreaming of a utopian horizon. Red Library out. Peace.